skill is not what is needed here, really.
No.
Because when you just use skill, it's tactical and it's not authentic, and people see that as ingenuine,
right,
and or disingenuine,
right,
and they'll shut down because people hate fake. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and they see it a mile away. So it's not something that's skill based, but you need a certain set of skill to get there.
Yes.
Right. And when he's saying is obviously based on, this is no surprise, but we need the habits 1, 2, and 3 as a solid foundation for then being authentic, and not letting this come across as a skill tactical based, like trying to manipulate or that kind of thing, and instead come off as a genuine attempt to understand the other individual. Right. So that's where the basis of these 4 stages come from. The first stage being mimicking, like you said, and again, mimicking is a skill, but we have to go beyond just mimicking what the other person said, but that's just the first stage.
Right. And when you do, if that's all you tend to do is mimic people, like if you were talking to me, he came up to me and said, "Hey, Chris, I'm really having trouble understanding this." I said, "Oh, you're really having trouble understanding this?" I mean, that just doesn't sound
I'm like,
that
are you just
genuine.
repeating me?
Yeah, you're just repeating me. And oftentimes when we do mimic people, he says something similar to this in the book, that, when we do just mimic people, it to me almost sounds like we're saying, yep, sure, like you do kind of over the phone when you're not really listening, you're really doing something else. That's kind of where it gets. So that's not really an empathetic style of communication as well, but we are building up to that, including this second stage.
Right. Yeah. And so the second stage then is moving from just mimicking, but to then changing what is said and adding, basically repeating what is said, but in your own words.
Right.
So you're taking it and delivering it in different words.
Right. You're really rephrasing the content is pretty much what you're doing.
Rephrasing the content.
Yeah. You're not saying it exactly the same, but and that tends to the hearer give a little bit more understanding, like, oh, okay, he kind of,
it shows that you're paying attention. You understand what they're talking about.
Right.
It was like, hey, Chris, I didn't understand this chapter at all.
Yeah.
And then you respond with, okay, I see you're
having a difficult time.
Yeah, you're having a
this.
difficult time understanding all this. Right. You say it in different words. You rephrase it.
Yeah.
And actually, I've thought about that for a few examples too. And I'm like, it's actually, when he gives the examples, you're like, okay, yeah, of course. But actually, when you sit down, and I thought of the other day, I was having a conversation with someone, and I thought about how I could rephrase it, and I'm like, you actually got to sit and think about it.
You do.
It's actually not as easy as you would think it would be, just to rephrase what someone's saying.
Right. But then when you
because I even struggled just then trying to give an example.
Right. No, really, no, it is really difficult. But when you do that, again, you're listening, and that's the hard part about this.
Yeah.
Is you're listening to respond, and that's not what this seek first to understand, is all about. Is we listen to listen, not to
listen
respond.
To understand. Yeah.
And so that's the difficult part about this, where again it does take some skill, but we don't want to pass off as ungenuine, like you said.
Because he also mentions at some other point in the chapter, he mentions the different types of listening. One is just complete ignoring.
Yeah.
Right. And then another one is selective listening.
Yeah.
And then another one is a higher level of listening where you're trying to understand. Then the next one is empathic listening, which is the one that Stephen Covey is pushing us towards, empathic listening, which involves not just understanding, but feeling the emotion behind what they're saying as well. And that's the difference here. Rephrasing the question helps give you the understanding. And then these next couple stages, as we get into stage 3 and stage 4, help with the emotional side of listening to get to that empathic level of listening. But yeah, it is difficult to even just rephrase the question sometimes, because again, you're just you have to really internalize what they're saying and then be able to repurpose that in your own words, to understand. And it's actually something, again, you have to practice. This is why he says there's skill involved. It's not just skill, but there is skill involved because you have to practice it.
Right.
So then the third, what's the third stage?
Is reflecting feelings. So we really move past just mimicking or kind of rephrasing what they say, but we really get into the grit of the emotion, because we have to remember, as we seek to understand, they are, especially at the beginning of what tends to be an emotional conversation, people or whoever is speaking to you, they say something, but they really may feel something different or very similar to what they're saying, but they don't come right out oftentimes and say exactly what they're feeling. So we have to reflect those feelings, and as we reflect those feelings correctly back to them, or in a real sense kind of draw from them what they're trying to say, but they're not really saying. If we say it for them, it kind of gives them an avenue to speak the rest of their feelings out and to explain a little bit further.
So then basically what stage 4 is then taking a combination of 2 and 3 and bringing it together. And so it's the rephrasing of content and reflecting the feeling, reflecting the emotion. And that is stage 4. And that's what Stephen Covey wants us to shoot for in communicating, in seeking to understand.
Right.
And properly doing that, rephrasing the content and reflecting the emotion, gives way to then people opening up, people talking more, people saying really what's truly on their mind.
Right. Right. Yeah, it really opens up the door for you to truly understand them, because I can't remember where I read this before, but it takes about 7 minutes in a deep conversation. This was not in the chapter in this book, but it takes about 7 minutes to really get into a deep conversation with someone. And so the deeper and deeper you can go, really the more that you rephrase their content and reflect their feelings, really the more you do this, the deeper and the deeper you can go. And not only do we see this and reflect feelings based off of what people are saying, but we also do it based off of how they look.
Right.
He gives different percentages in this chapter for that. And I believe he said about 60% of our communication is body language.
It's nonverbal, yeah.
It's nonverbal, so it's not actually what we say. So that's another way that we reflect, is looking at people and then being able to tell, okay, what are they feeling, or how can I rephrase this in a way that wouldn't lean them towards becoming more emotional, because when they do, you want to reflect more feelings, but figuring out a logical solution for themselves, which was the beauty behind the dad and the son, and him breaking out these stages and him breaking out this communication style, because you saw that the son really came up with his own solutions, and the dad really didn't have to give that much advice until the son asked for it. When someone gives you permission, that's the important part. That's when you've really done a good job of reflecting those feelings.
Yep, exactly. And that's the thing that stuck out to me at the end of all this. And he talks about versus the logical and the emotional side of a conversation and the side of communication. And basically, you in your stage 4 response, in communicating in that way, it opens up to the other person to then be able to respond in a logical way, to have a logical response, not in just a purely emotional response. And so when someone responds in a logical response, then you can then give your input and advice if they're asking for it.
Right.
But then as soon as they turn emotional again, Stephen Covey says, once they turn emotional again, then you have to go back to empathic listening. Because when someone is emotional and speaking out of emotion, they're not really open to input, basically.
Yeah.
And you see that play out in the examples that he gives, is that when they turn logical and they're say, because that example with the son, he's like, hey, what would you do in this situation, Dad? And he's like, yeah, I think maybe you should look at this. And then his son gives an emotional response. And so then he goes back to listening. And then after he listens some more, the son asks another question. Okay, so then what do you think about this? And then Dad says, okay, this is what I think about this. And so they can go on. And so it's very interesting that coin of logical versus emotional and balance, and flipping that coin depending on how you respond to the other person.
Right. And it's strange that wildly emotional son at the beginning of the conversation seemed to be quite logical at the end, by the end of the conversation, and that's just what we need, and that's what communication does for all of us, is it kind of navigates us through these messy waters of life. And so it can be a really powerful thing, as we saw in that example.